Well, I'm on the banks of Lough Erne with Fred Ternan. Fred, thanks very much indeed for joining us. You're going to tell us a bit about your history and a bit about the history of your family and this area. We're obviously looking at the period 1912 to 1923 for Fermanagh and Omagh District Council. But everything is connected with everything else. So we're going to talk about that period, but maybe other stuff around it that that period is affected as well. So Fred, thanks very much.
Okay.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, my family has always lived in this area. In fact, where my father came from was less than a mile away from here, and the wee house is still there, the remains of it. So we moved to this house about over 30 years ago, and before that, actually, I had lived on an island on the loch where I was born. Now, I'm the youngest of a family of 5, and my father was born in 1901. He was maybe the second youngest of 9 children, and all his older siblings were all born in the 1890s, as far as I can remember. So he would have had been able to tell us bits and pieces, but of course many of them had left and emigrated, and he didn't really remember that much about them. The one interesting one that he used to talk about was his brother Michael. And his brother Michael, I can't remember what age he was, but again, a good deal older than my father. And he had left to go and work in Belfast when he was only 14 or thereabouts. And the legend is that he made a wooden frame for a bicycle into which he put the wheels on, and he headed off on that. That man ended up driving trams in Belfast. Obviously, he had the experience of horses and that coming from the country. But the interesting thing is that he began work in the shipyard in Belfast and worked on the Titanic, the building of the Titanic. And he, when the Titanic was launched, he was one of the people who travelled on her to Southampton. I think, as far as I know, there was still a little bit of finishing off to be done, which was done on the journey to there. And then his intention was, with others, to work their way on the Titanic as stokers across to America. But the story told to me always was that on the night before they were to set off, something happened. This was the term that was used. So we never really quite knew what the something was. But anyway, he missed the boat, him and others. But his daughter is still alive in Australia, and she was over here a few years ago. But apparently they went partying the night before, and whatever took place after that, that's what caused them to miss the boat. Now, because his mother and father didn't realise he had missed the boat, they thought he had gone, and of course the story of the ship going down, and they thought he was drowned, and they didn't know anything about him, and they just assumed that was the case, and they never heard anything. But he did some travelling after that, and then he ended up joining the army and was in the First World War, and he was at Gallipoli. And during the war, he was on leave, and he came home, and he arrived at the door of the house, and of course they nearly fainted, because this was the person who they thought had been drowned in 1912. So he ended up, he lived in London all his life then, and I think he stayed in the army for quite a while. And that was the legend of my Uncle Mick, as he was known.
So your Uncle Mick left the area, and his parents were still here, and he had worked on the Titanic and the shipyard, and had travelled on the Titanic. Didn't tell anybody at the time, it sounds it, but he missed the boat because he had a hangover from the previous
something
night.
like that, yeah, or maybe even they got locked up for whatever they were at, I don't know, but they missed. It's interesting that in the film The Titanic, it shows the scene in Southampton where they were setting off, and a whole lot of the men running down to the dock, and the gate was closed and they weren't allowed in. And those may have been, he may have been amongst, if that part of the film is true, that he may well have been part of that group. I don't know.
And the parents thought he was
They thought he was drowned because his other brother actually worked on the Titanic as well. Willie, he went off to off to Canada, and he actually joined the army in Canada and was in the Canadian Army in the First War. So I think it was him who told them that he was going to work his way across to America. And that was the last they heard until he turned up.
And what happened? Do you know, or what do you think happened whenever he turned up after fighting in Gallipoli?
Yeah, they were obviously very shocked, but when they got over their shock, I suppose, then they were delighted to see him, I suppose. But again, you see, well, my father at that stage probably would have been, well, he was born, so he'd have been, say, 15 or 16. But that's all I remember. That's all we heard, really. It was just the fact that he turned up at that stage. But he was home a couple of times after that, but not an awful lot as far as I can gather. But he was, that's the legend. It is an actual story.
The legend of your Uncle Mick.
That's right.
It's quite a story as well.
So then I mentioned that other brother. He was in the First World War from Canada. And then there was another brother. He joined here. He was in the UVF. It was formed in 1912, I think, and he was a member of that. And then, as we know, the UVF all joined up, and that became part of the 36th Ulster Division. And he was one of those people. In fact, there's a list in one of the papers of all the men from the area who set off to Finner Camp, which is where they went first. And then after some training there, they then walked to Randallstown, as you do. And then from there on to the Western Front. So he spent the whole, he survived it, but he was shot 3 times and gassed twice. I think that was the way of it. So,
and what was his name?
He was Matt.
Matt.
So and one of the bullets was still in him. It was too close to his heart and they couldn't remove it, so he carried that for the rest of his life. Never seemed to do him any harm.
He was shot 3 times and gassed twice.
That's right.
Do you know what battles he fought in when he was over there?
Well, he was in the Battle of the Somme. I think he was wounded. In fact, there's a bit of an old paper here, and I always meant to dig it out again and have a look at it. I think he may have been wounded on the first day of the Somme, which probably saved his life, possibly. But then he'd have been patched up and sent back in again, so. And then I remember him talking about the flooding of the trenches, so he may have been at Passchendaele as well. And then after he died, a long time, we were clearing out the house and we found a letter written to him by a man from Armagh, whose brother had served with him. And the man wrote the letter to him and talked about his brother, often telling him the story about that awful day at San Quentin. And apparently that was when the Russians had withdrawn and the Germans were able to bring so many more troops into the Western Front. And apparently that battle was horrendous altogether because it was hand-to-hand fighting in the woods all night. So it was just a question of, I suppose, kill or be killed. But apparently it was terrible altogether, but that was what it was,
And Matt was involved in this?
Yes,
side
that's
by
right.
side with this
this man from Armagh. So, and as I say, it was difficult because the Germans were able to put all their forces onto the Western Front then, because the Russians they came out of the war, I think, 1917, I think. So that was another battle, I remember. Not that, I suppose really, when I think now of the questions I could have asked him, but you didn't really know enough, when you're younger to ask sort of the right questions, you're sort of asking about the gory details. I do remember asking him a question one time. I asked him, where were all the dead soldiers buried, which is something a young person would ask. And I remember his answer very clearly. He said, "Son," he says, "we buried them in shell holes." So it was just a question, I suppose, of getting them out of the way, So that was what they did.
It's shocking, isn't it?
It is actually, that's right, surely.
It's just 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago.
The strange thing is I volunteer in but I don't know, obviously with COVID, but up to that, I volunteered in the Enniskillings Regimental Museum, and we would do the sort of the reception or welcome desk or whatever, and people would come in and talk about, obviously, relatives that they had in the war and all the rest of it. But so many people all referred to their grandfather or great uncles or whatever, whereas in fact, because of the situation, with me being the youngest of quite a big family, I actually had uncles in it, which is a bit strange really, given the fact that most other people's grandfathers and what have you fought in it. But that's just the way it worked out.
One of the things that occurs to me is when you talk about Matt and when you talk about Mick and the other brother from Canada,
Willie.
It's a family that obviously went in different directions in terms of where they lived and where they put down their roots, which happened all over,
of course,
at that time. But in an era when you didn't have telephones much, and you didn't have emails, and text messages, and so on. So there's poor Mick's parents thinking he had died in the Titanic, and he shows up 4 years later.
That's right. That's right. Strange.
We don't know how lucky we are.
No, indeed. You see, but then I suppose people were accustomed to that. That if you received a letter, you might get a letter once every few years, maybe never. I mean, most people who emigrated, they were gone, and that was it, and probably never heard tell of them again. But so many people from around here emigrated, and lots of, as I said, my father came from just along here a bit, and the Ternan family we know lived there in the same place, going back, we have them traced back to the early 1700s. And I believe that maybe I did find something in the Public Records Office once, and it was the name Ternan would have been Mac Ternan at one stage, and there was a Mac Ternan in the same town land. So we think they were there for years and years and years. So, and in fact, one time when I was poking around on the internet, I found the townland is Rosqueer, and Rosqueer is quite a big townland. And I knew that there are 2 drumlins in it, and one part of it seemed to be called Rosqueer Ternan, because there were a lot of Ternans living in it, and the other part was Rosqueer Leith. So I thought, there must be Leiths there. So I started looking for Leiths until I discovered that Leith is Irish for half or part. So it was the Ternan bit and the other part, It wasn't anybody called Leith at all.
Tell me that, and either don't answer this if you don't want to. We'll do something with it. But when your uncles returned from those experiences into an Ireland, apart from Willie, who was over in Canada, presumably, they returned to an Ireland that over the 2 or 3 years since the war in 1918 through to 1921 took on a very different feel and shape. Do you know did they experience that in any way themselves?
I don't know. You see, Matt was the only one who came back. Mick stayed in London.
Okay.
And Willie was in Canada, and he was never back again. And it's interesting that Mick, whilst he was in the army and whilst he was in London, he always called himself Willie, because with the surname Tiernan, as it would have been pronounced, and the first name Mick, and given what was going on, just as at that time in London, he felt it safer to call himself Willie. So when Matt came back, I'm not quite sure, but I mentioned that before the war he was in the UVF, but after the war he was not involved in anything at all. I'd say after the experiences that he had picked up on there, he wouldn't have been interested, to say the least.
But it's interesting that Mick, tell us a bit more about that. So Mick doesn't come back, he stays in London, but calls himself Willie, which is one of his brothers.
That's right. Well, Willie was in Canada, so there wasn't going to be any problem.
and I think what you're saying is in England at that time when there was troubles in Ireland.
Yeah.
That the best thing is not to be associated with a name like Mick.
That's it. And again, the surname Ternan, you see, is an Irish name. And I suppose that's, that could have, well, depending on where you were and who you were, who you met, that sort of thing. So he must have judged it safer to call himself Willie anyway.
Which is resonances for the 1970s and 80s, doesn't it? Where anti-Irish feeling is
That's it. Yeah.
And was occurring back in
Yeah.
1990.
Oh, it was indeed, surely. That's right, surely. And he would have experienced that, I suppose, had he stayed on in the shipyard as well, you see. But obviously he was joining the army and then staying in the army because he was out in Palestine as well for a long time after that. And there's a photograph of him and the team. He was a gunner in the war. And there's a photograph of the team, sitting on the gun. There's a big howitzer or whatever they call it. So, but he was badly wounded in Gallipoli. His daughter was saying in his arm with a bayonet, because they were so close to each other, they just had to jump out and stab someone and jump back into the trench again. So,
how do you think he and his brothers coped with that when they came back? I don't mean about situation in Ireland or particularly on a personal level, because you go through presumably significant trauma when you're
that's it, you see.
in hand-to-hand
yeah.
fighting. Did they get any support?
No, No, well, apparently after the First World War, there was no support for an awful lot of people, and people who were disabled as a result of the act. Lots of those people didn't have any money and had no way of making any money. Now, when he came back, he actually got married and went to live on another island, and he lived there and farmed and fished. And I suppose maybe the peace of the island might have been good too, I don't know.
He was back in Fermanagh?
Yeah, the island's just, I showed you Inishmixent over there, well, it's just the island beside that. So he lived there until he died. Okay. But no, there was never any talk about it really, so far as I can remember, but there's something else I was going to mention there, but I've forgotten now, but it'll probably come back to me again.
While you're thinking about it, let me ask you, because let me just jump forward a few years, but continuing on a similar theme. So we're overlooking Lough Erne. It's absolutely stunning. I'm very jealous that you are able to see this view every single day. But we're very close to what used to be an RAF base, I think. Tell us a bit about that, because the events we're talking about so far, 1914 to 18, 1919, 20, 21, just 20 years later, there was another war, of course, and the RAF were using this area. Tell us a bit more about what they did.
Well, the RAF had difficulty in patrolling the Atlantic, and their nearest base didn't get them far enough out, and there was a bit in the middle of the Atlantic that couldn't be covered, and that's where the U-boats waited and all the rest of it. So they surveyed Lough Erne. I think it was on Christmas Day of 1941, I think, and they decided it would be a base. Now, the big issue with the base here in Northern Ireland was the fact that Southern Ireland was between Lough Erne and the Atlantic. So that would have meant that they would have had to fly up north, up around Donegal, and then out into the Atlantic, obviously meaning that they wouldn't have been able to go as far into the Atlantic. So apparently a secret deal was done between one of the top men in the British government and the president of Southern Ireland, De Valera, which allowed them to fly out over Ballyshannon, and that became known as the Donegal Corridor. Now, it wasn't meant to be talked about because no one wanted the Germans to know, because then Southern Ireland could have lost its neutrality. But that continued for the war, so it must have worked all right. And it didn't mean that they could travel a further couple of 100 miles or whatever out into the Atlantic. So, that base it reduced in size at the end of the war, but it continued to be an RAF base right up until 1957. And the RAF operated on the entire loch, and they had planes moored all over the loch, obviously spread out as far as possible. The other interesting thing too is, and I only discovered this fairly recently, is that the Bow Island, which is a big island at the northern end of the loch, and it had only recently been joined to the mainland by bridges. That was as a result of partition. But the Bow Island, they had a big base on the Bow Island as well, and it was almost like a backup base in case Castle Archdale got bombed. And it was from there that they brought the depth charges up the loch by bomb scow, they were called, a boat, and they were loaded onto the planes. And some of that, one of the ordnance huts is still there, concrete hut with iron door, and that's one of them is still on the Bow Island. But I mentioned about it being joined to the mainland, and when partition came about, obviously one of the things that had been overlooked, and it meant that the only way to get from one part of Northern Ireland to another place in Northern Ireland was to go through the south. And of course, with all the difficulties that there was, that was going to be difficult. And the people on the Bow Island found that situation. They had always travelled by boat to Donegal, to the Donegal shore, but then, of course, with difficulties at the border and all the rest of it, they couldn't do that. So then eventually in 1928, the islands were joined up with bridges. I'm not too sure of the whole detail, but it's something along those lines.
It's really interesting though. So from partition happened in 1921, border posts appearing 22, 21, 22, right up until 1928, people still had to go into the south to get to other parts of the north, and that would have included maybe army and B specialists.
Well, they couldn't, you see, and that was their problem, I suppose.
Right.
And in fact, the loch here had steamboats on it in the 1800s and up into the 1900s. And in fact, one of the steamboats was assembled on the field out here in front of the house in the 1860s. The water level at that time was higher, so they were able to assemble it and then shove it into the loch. Okay. So, and that boat was called the Rosclair, because this is the townland of Rosclair. Then it became known as the Lady of the Lake. And then at some stage in the 1900s, there was a woman from Enniskillen called Lady Laverton, and she bought it and she converted it to a houseboat and called it the Pandora. Now, during the time of the partition and the strife that there was, I think they called it the Billig salient. That was that area that was somehow in a peculiar situation because of the border. And there was the Battle of Billig or whatever, and she actually used her boat to bring some of the B specials down the loch to help in the battle with the IRA. So this is just a little story, a legend that we all had heard of. But I remember my father telling me that he remembered seeing this woman on occasions, and what he told me was that she always wore a hat which looked like an Australian bush hat. Now, whether it was or not, we don't know. But the interesting thing, and this sort of is a sign of the times as they were at that time, she would walk about through Enniskillen with a revolver in a holster on her side. Mm-hmm. You know, civilian walking about with a... So that's sort of what was going on back then. Mm-hmm. But she took this boat down anyway, and that's as much as I say we knew. But then we discovered then she must have emigrated to New Zealand, and she must have told her story to the papers, because you can actually find it on the web. And one of the stories was that she was anchored at Fermanagh Castle, which is on the way to Billig. And the IRA, there were sluice gates at Billig at that time, and the IRA had opened the sluice gates to let the water run away so that she would be grounded. So she had to get the anchor up fairly quickly, and they were apparently under fire. So she said that she was able to return the fire and get the anchor up as well. So she was a stout lady, this woman, if the story is true.
And And she would be walking around with her bush hat and her
Yes,
a revolver.
revolver.
At her hip.
That's right. My father saw her wearing it, so.
It's like the Wild West.
Just, indeed, that's right. But you see, it probably was, because a lot of the country, from the UVF and the gun running, and there was gun running obviously for the National Volunteers as well, so there were guns all over the place. And those guns, a lot of them were buried afterward because there was hundreds of them. And nearly every house would have had one or would have known where there was one. And some of them even turned up. I remember having this conversation with a man, only a couple of years ago, and he's from Donegal. And he says, I remember those old rifles. He says, we had lots of them. He says, we used to use them to shoot seals. So, the place was coming down with guns as far as I can gather. But the thing that I have often thought about, those men who joined the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Irish Volunteer Force were all supposed to be equipped with rifles. But, if it had come to a shooting war, the army wouldn't return fire with rifles. They used shells, and those men would have been destroyed. They would have been expected to face the army with rifles, which doesn't happen. Look what happened in the First World War. It was shelling all the time, and all right, there was rifle fire as well, but that's what would have happened to them.
The army would have kept a distance.
Oh yes, and just shelled, and that would have been it. So fortunately, it never came to that.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing at the time was, and it's where this area I think would be unique to places like Belfast, where you had a lot of sectarian tension everywhere, but in Belfast, people getting killed. I suppose this area is different in the sense of it's close to the border. It's a very uncertain time. People, while there's lots of politics going on and partition has happened, there are people either side of the border who want to be in a different place, whether it be Unionists here in the south or Nationalists in the north. And there's just a lot of uncertainty around.
Well, you see, at that time, I suppose, there were people who opposed the setting up of both of the state, and then those people who opposed partition, and there was all sorts of opinions on it, but it was happening all the time. But the thing was that people still had to continue to live in the country area like this. There weren't any factories or jobs as well. It was all working on the land, or if you were lucky enough to have a job in a shop or something. So anybody who stayed in the area still had to make a living or survive at least. So no matter which side of the border you ended up on, you were still trying to continue to carry on your existence. So and that probably took preference in many cases over anything else, because you had to live. So it must have been a strange time, there's no doubt about it. And of course here in Fermanagh, as well as you had the issue at Billig, the places where the border was drawn. There's a place in South Fermanagh, and there's a little bit of the south sticks up into Fermanagh, which is a most peculiar thing to do, but it would appear that they drew the border around the boundaries of the town lands. So, this bit of the south sticks up, and to get from one side of it to the other, you have to drive through the south. So, strange things like that, which obviously, it wasn't terribly well thought out, I suppose, really.
I suppose people just coped as well as they could. I'm mindful of your story about the facts of having to build 3 new bridges, including at Rosscar down there as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, the Rosscar Bridge as well, that's right. I think that was more for convenience, because it meant that people could get, otherwise you had to go right down into Billig and then back up again. But it probably was due to the fact that the border was put there. And then on the Upper Loch, you have bridges there. They were built up around the Upper Loch area, South Fermanagh. Belturbet was the main town before partition. And then, of course, after partition, it had to be Enniskillen, even though many people out of the border are much closer to Belturbet. Then they had the same problem up there, getting across the river. You had to go into Belturbet, into the south, to get back into the north. So eventually they got round to building bridges between Lisnaskea and Derrylin, and they were referred to as the new bridges. and they were built in the 1930s, and they're still called the new bridges.
They're 80 odd years old, but they're still the new bridges.
They are.
And they were just a consequence of partition
They
again.
would have been, that's right. Now, prior to the bridges being built, they had ferries across the loch, and they were Lough Erne cots, which they used to ferry across. And there was a ferry that operated quite close to where the bridges are now built, and that you could bring horses and carts and things and all that on across. And there were a number of places where there were ferries across before there were bridges. And ferry routes on the loch and in every waterway go right back, apparently, right into antiquity, you know, where people had travelled, where it was convenient to cross over in whatever form of transport there might have been at the time.
It strikes me that there is a lot of coping with the consequence of a order in 1921, and people are just getting on with it as best they can. You have small acts that ease people's lives, like the bridges, and then when it's necessary, the governments come in with a big act, which is to say, let's have the Dublin Corridor in 1940s onwards because of the Second World War.
Yeah.
So in different ways, people just actually manage their way around the border.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It was, I'm sure, an inconvenience when it was set up because of the fact that you had to go through the border posts. But then, of course, there were what was called the unapproved roads, and they weren't approved for transporting of goods from one side to the other. But of course, the road was there. You know, if there wasn't anybody on the road, well, that's the road that the goods were taken down. So the unapproved roads were wide open. And they were very convenient, of course, as well.
And there would have been a bit of smuggling going on.
Yes,
I'm quite
apparently
sure.
smuggling was a big thing. And
Do you think it's things that your family would have been involved with?
no,
in a small way?
there might have been the odd ounce of tobacco or that sort of thing smuggled if you were coming on a trip from the south. But major smuggling that was done, a lot of it was done on the southern end of Fermanagh by water. And apparently at one stage, there was some sort of fertilizer needed for the beetroot, for sugar beet industry. I think that's the way it was. And this was smuggled by the boatload. An ordinary rowing boat could carry half a ton at least. And then the Lough Erne cot, depending on the size of it, could carry far more. And that went on all the time, up and down the river at night. So, because the border crosses, and of course the border doesn't run in a straight line. And once you know where you are, then you know exactly which side you're on. And it's just, you know, where Crum Castle is, the border crosses the loch just a bit above that. So apparently this went on all the time, and smuggling animals and all sorts of stuff.
And a lot of small personal use smuggling went on as well.
Of course, any chance there was, you know, to bring something that was easily carried would have been brought across.
A little butter here. And
That's
some
right.
eggs there,
That's
and
right.
a litre
But
or two.
tobacco and that sort of thing. Tobacco was my father smoked a pipe, and anybody going to visit or going to down for a day trip to the south, some tobacco was always brought back because it was cheaper.
And you weren't allowed to do that.
Oh,
so
no,
you
no.
had to hide it. As
Yeah.
well
Oh, you
as
had, of
through the
course.
customs.
Yeah, that's true. And if they, you know, if they would have asked you if you had anything to declare, well, you had to tell a lie.
I take it they probably knew you were telling
They
them.
probably did, of course, because they knew that everybody was bringing someone across. And I don't know what you could bring the other way. I really don't know, you know, but there certainly was smuggling, and you know, and various scales.
You talked about the southern Fermanagh and larger scale smuggling on the waterway, and Lough Erne is such a huge place. I mean, Lough Erne will have been the major feature of this area for not just decades but centuries.
Oh yes.
Millennia. Tell us a bit about Lough Erne. I mean, and is it recognised enough, for example, in terms of the importance in this area, and how do you go about making sure it is?
Well, I think it should be more. It should. In fact, that's something that we're trying to do since we set up an organisation called Lough Erne Heritage about 5 years ago, to try and emphasise the significance the loch had in the lives of people in Fermanagh and the surrounding counties as well. And of course, back centuries ago, and indeed even a couple of hundred years ago, the loch was much bigger, and it was reduced in size as a result of a couple of drainage schemes. But you have to remember that until drainage as we know it today, farm drainage, land drainage and all that sort of thing, until that came into being, there was no such thing as drainage. If the water moved at all, you just avoided it. So therefore, if a river got blocked with trees and all the rest of it, and the flood went out over the land, if there was low-lying land, that just happened. So on occasions, a great deal of Fermanagh would have been underwater. In fact, around the upper loch, there's a lot of low-lying land there, and that still floods. And in fact, the road that goes round the upper loch is quite far away from the loch itself. Like on the lower loch here, you can see a lot of the loch from the road in places, but on the upper loch, you can't do that because the road had to be that far away to avoid all the water that was lying there, So something I would love to see is, and I know it can be done with technology, I've seen it done on television where they can flood an area. And that's something I would love to see done for a map of Fermanagh. Flood it using technology to where the water would have been on occasions, So it would just be interesting to see. Just
it'd be fascinating to see which areas you would no longer be able to see anymore.
That's right. I mean, the road here the main road that you were on, had you driven on down, that my father referred to that as the new line, which means that must have been built in maybe not his time, but in his grandfather's time or whatever, because the road before that was up on the higher ground, it's not really a hill, but it's a bit higher. So, because that's where it would have had to be, because the low-lying ground through which that road now runs would have been flooded on occasions with the water coming in from the loch. So it would have been a different,
And I suppose most people's livelihood around here would have depended on it. Even when you go back 100 odd years, I suppose most people's livelihood would have depended on the loch.
To a great
and the farms, obviously.
The farms, yeah, but the farms, of course, weren't that productive, like nowadays. And I suppose a lot of people around the loch, and particularly those people living on islands, they managed better because they were able to fish as well. And so you had good healthy food coming in as often as you wanted it. And then there was eel fishing was a commercial proposition, and the eels were fished for and they were exported. Now when the trains came, that meant that they could export them to London. And I can remember eels being exported to Billingsgate to a company there, and they were brought into Irvinstown in special boxes. The eels were put into the boxes. Ice was broken up and put in with the eels, and of course the boxes then began to drip. But the boxes were nailed shut. There was a label put on them, and off they went on the train. And then the check then came back the next week or whatever for the eels. But that's how the eels were transported, not in water, but in boxes with ice.
And it's interesting for that period that we're talking about as well, 1912 to 23, where all of this upheaval was going on politically, and yet life like that would have carried on. The
yes,
were still being caught and boxed and iced and packed off to the market.
That's right. The life, I was saying, even with the setting up of the border, people on either side of it still had to carry on, and whilst there might have been differences of opinions on occasions, people still had to live as neighbours and work together and all the rest of it. So. That's one of those things, peculiar things of Ireland, I suppose. But
how would I'm thinking back to Mick and Willie and Matt. There may be other brothers or sisters who lived in the area who left. But how do you think their leaving the area at that time would have affected their parents and the family?
Well, I suppose, you see, it was normal for people to leave because obviously the families were bigger back then. The small farms that people had were only 25 or 30 acres. So, whoever was going to get the farm was probably the only person who stayed at home. The girls would have all got married off, hopefully, or emigrated. So immigration was quite normal. Maybe not necessarily out of the country, but certainly to the cities. And the only, until Belfast began to grow, Dublin was the main city. So lots of people would have gone. They had to go somewhere because they couldn't have survived. The farm would not. And farming then was only really subsistence. You kept a couple of animals and grew all the vegetables and that sort of thing. And so therefore you could only produce so much to maintain so many people. And therefore it was a question, and I suppose people were conditioned to leaving, just as simple as that.
It was just a normal thing that happened in life, I suppose, that
grow up and go away, basically.
And some of the sons, one or two of the sons presumably would have been expected. You're taking on the farm,
That's
the
it.
rest of you have to do something else.
Yeah, that's right. So it was a strange situation, because I suppose as soon as you became old enough, you realised, well, look, I'm not going to be staying here forever. So, and people, again, as you were saying earlier, no communication in those days, so off you went. And, you had to walk. I got a phone call here a few years ago from, I sounded American, I was actually Canadian, and he was here on holiday, and he knew that his mother, I think, had the same surname as me, and that she came from Fermanagh, or an ancestor of hers had come from Fermanagh. So wherever he was staying, they told him, he wondered if there were still any Ternans. So there are only 4 Ternans in the phone book. So he phoned me, and with a little bit of research that I had done, once he gave me a bit of detail, I was able to tell him who his ancestor was, and that she was actually connected to me, and that her father had emigrated in the 1840s with the family. So, to emigrate in the 1840s, or any time, you had to walk. I don't think the trains weren't here at that time. So how did you get to Derry to get the boat? When you set off walking, you wouldn't obviously do it in one day. So where did you stay? All those sort of things, that people had to go through to get to the port, and then suffer the journey then after that. So that's who he was. He was staying here. So it was interesting to chat to him. And then, of course, we took him up to see the house where she would have lived, and where that person's father or grandfather was buried and all the rest of it. And I think at the end of it all, he just had got too much information, really. So
that's fantastic. It really is brilliant.
Yeah.
2 things occur to me. Just one is, it must be really gratifying to be able to do that for someone coming here and be able to point to the cottage or the house.
That's right.
That they're linked with in terms of their ancestors. I think that's a wonderful thing to be able to do. But it would be occurring to me, if I was you, I'd be thinking to myself, how many other relatives do I have living in Canada? Because presumably he's not related to Willie, who
No, Willie, he wasn't married, as it turned out, but there was another brother, George. I forgot about him, and he emigrated as well at some stage. He was older than my father as well. He went out and got work on a farm, and because people like that who had the experience of working with horses and land and that sort of thing would have been in great demand as Canada was opening up. He got work on a farm, and the people on the farm didn't have any family, and he ended up being left the farm. So, but I don't know when he would have emigrated. No, I don't know when he emigrated. I don't know, but he must have went. No, I have no idea. But anyway,
probably around that same period. Ages.
That's right.
And so on. Do you ever go and visit Canada and look up?
No, funny. That man who came over, he was able to tell us quite a lot, because a lot of the Ternans who emigrated went to the same sort of area, in a town called Arthur. And apparently the land around there was very good. So, and apparently there's a museum or library in Arthur, and there's a lot of information about the Canadian Ternans, most of whom would have come from here. Yeah, so I must go sometime.
You need to.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Fred, you said you were going to mention something else earlier. I don't know if you...
I can't remember what it was, but I do something else that I could tell you about the time of the Battle of Billeek or Pettigo or whatever it was called. My mother, she was born actually in...
This was 1922?
Yeah,
I think so.
it was.
Start that again, just to tell us about
And at the time of the Battle of Bleak, which was around the time of partition in 1921-22, and she was, my mother's family had moved to Fermanagh because her father was left a farm here. She was born in the Newton Abbey area, what's now known as Newton Abbey, but at that time there wouldn't have been very many houses. So they had moved to here, and she can remember at that time, they lived near here, but reasonably high up. Well, not that high, but a bit higher than here. And she can remember hearing the horses towing the big guns down the shore road to go down to take part in the Battle of Bleak. They could hear the sound carries across the loch, and they could hear the jingles, I suppose, and and the noise of the carriage, the horses, and the gun carriage, and all the rest of it. She can remember that, but that's her only memory of it.
That's extraordinary, because we don't think of the troubles at that time as involving big guns, heavy guns, and artillery and so on. But in the Battle of Bleak, Perigo,
that's right,
obviously was quite a substantial.
There was. I don't think there was that many rounds fired out of the big guns, but there was some fired. So I suppose if they were, I don't know. I remember my brother-in-law, his relatives lived near Perigo, and he said that I think they either, I can't remember now whether they fired from near their house or whether the shell went over their house. I'm not quite sure, but obviously he had heard stories about it as well, So.
Anything else you want to talk about? I'm just noticing we're nearly 50 minutes, which is a long time. So thank you for your time.
You're welcome. I think I've covered most of what I can remember, but as I say, there's probably things I'll remember when you go. I think I should have mentioned that,
If there is, we can do another session at some point over the summer. But I'm just thinking about an extraordinary family. I mean, the story of, the Willie and Matt and George taking over a farm in Canada as well. Fantastic. But Mick is the one that. That's
right. He's the famous guy.
He walks in he works in the Titanic. Misses the boat, thankfully.
Yeah.
Goes and serves in Gallipoli and all sorts of other places, and then comes home to his parents who go, "You're alive!"
Yeah,
it's an extraordinary story.
Apparently, he was a great inventor as well, and in the army, he invented a number of things. And the story that was always told was that the guns bogged, the big heavy guns bogged.
This is your uncle Mick.
Mick, that's right. And
he helped build the Titanic. Fought in the battle.
That's right. And I don't know where else he would have fought, because obviously Gallipoli didn't last that long. But he drew up, he sketched out an idea for. It was some sort of attachment to the wheels of the guns that would made them easier to handle. But he didn't take it through to say, and he just, as my father said, he just left them there. And the story is that some officer then picked up on this, and he got the credit for this invention.
You should have copyrighted it.
Yeah, that's right, surely. But these are the sort of stories that I remember being told, at that time. Mainly the Titanic and the World Wars and that sort of thing, and the partition and what have you. So at the formation also, if I could just remember this now, at that time when Northern Ireland was set up, there were forces set up as well in support of the police. There was A specials, B specials and C specials. The A specials and the C specials didn't last very long, but the B specials did last for quite a long time. And I remember a story told at that time. My father was in the B specials at the time of at the beginning, as he referred to it as. And I remember a story he told, which just happened at the top of our road here. They were on patrol, which meant they were really standing chatting, I suppose. And there was a noise heard down at the loch. At that time, you could actually see the loch. You see down where it was from where they were standing. And they listened for a while and sounded rather suspicious. Now, nothing ever happened around here, so... But I suppose they were all young and they were all dying to get fire in their rifles, you see. So they asked the guy in charge, "What'll we do? What'll we do, Sarge?" or whatever they said to him. And he said, blaze away like blazes. So they opened up, of course, keen to get fire in these. And my father thought afterwards, he says, if there was some fella down who was doing a wee bit of poaching or something like that, he would have been very, very scared.
He wouldn't be doing poaching much.
No, not at all, not at all, surely. So what the noise was, they never found out, but they got fire in their rifles anyway.
Brilliant. They got fire in their rifles. Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. Fred, anything else you want to talk about?
No, I can't think of anything else at the minute.
I'm going to stop this.
Yeah, that's fine.
Listen, I really appreciate that. That is brilliant. I'm so in awe of your family. Can I tell you,